that this is what the world looks like to us. We've filtered it, we've construed it, we've constructed it partly. And what we see is the construction. We don't see all the things that constructed it. And therefore, it's just that's a ineluctable product of our experience. You get people to appreciate the role of luck in life. This is not to take away from, how hard people have worked, and they deserve credit for having worked hard and exercised great skill. But there are so many people out there with the same drive and the same skill who never got the chance or didn't get the little lucky break, and having an appreciation of that really feeds the whole gratitude cycle. But if you recognize, no, that's the way the world looks to them, and it really feels right, you've got a different situation with respect to that person. And it makes you, okay, they aren't picking a fight here. That's the way they see it. We differ. Okay, how can we see it the same?
Welcome to the Performance Initiative Podcast.
Our goal is to provide you and ourselves with the tools to be the best versions of ourselves.
We are your hosts, Dr. Grant Cooper
and Dr. Zinovi Maley. We just wrapped up a conversation with Thomas Gilovich.
Tom is a giant in the field of psychology. He is the Irene Blecker Rosenfeld Professor of Psychology at Cornell University. He's conducted research in social psychology, decision-making, behavioral economics, written a bunch of books that we both really enjoyed reading. He's collaborated with Nobel Prize winner Daniel Kahneman, Richard Nisbett, Lee Ross, Amos Tversky, the list goes on. Tons of peer-reviewed articles, a wealth of information, both academic and practical.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And just to give you an idea of what we talked about, have you ever felt like there was a literal spotlight on you when you walk into the room and wondered if there's any truth to that?
It's happening right now.
Yeah. Have you ever thought about whether or not someone will make a decision based on how you frame the question?
There's understanding our own biases, other people's biases, how to navigate the world the best way possible. And we couldn't possibly do the conversation justice in this next minute. So please just enjoy this one.
Enjoy it.
Tom, thank you so much for taking the time to have this conversation. We really appreciate it. We loved your books. And there's so much, as we were saying before we started this, that we'd like to get into, that if it's okay, we'll just jump right in.
That sounds great.
So we thought we'd start with patterns. And something that you talk about is that we tend to see order where really there is none that exists. So for example, we see the moon and we see a face in the moon. We see patterns in the stars. In the world of sports, for basketball fans, we tend to believe in the hot hands. For non-basketball fans out there, a hot hand is when a basketball player makes a couple of shots and then everyone believes that he has a hot hand or she has a hot hand and she's going to make the next shot as well. And what I've learned from reading your book is that that's a statistical fallacy and there's really no hot hand. And so my head understands that a hot hand isn't real, but my heart can't quite get there because it's so ingrained in the way that I've watched basketball for so many years. So why is it that we're so intent on seeing order when there is none?
I mean, it's hard to resist the kind of glib evolutionary theorizing that's easy to do, which is, that's the job of the brain, is to detect patterns out in the world so that we can anticipate really what's out there. And it's really hard to build any kind of machine that works perfectly. There are a lot of benefits for detecting all of the patterns that are out there. And there are some interesting cases where it overshoots and sees more things than are actually out there. And that evolutionary account, if you will, is reinforced by the idea that one of the most common things we see when it's not there are animated things. We have to be on alert for other animate things more than inanimate things. And, famously, I think Dan Gilbert was the first person to put it this way. It's interesting that we see faces in clouds. We don't see clouds in faces. So there are certain kinds of errors that we're
Right.
more predisposed to make. And any of your listeners could go on YouTube and type in pareidolia, which is seeing patterns in physical stimuli that aren't there. And just a ton of them are about faces. Well, the example you started with, we see a person in the moon.
Right.
We don't see a hamburger in the moon or a truck in the moon.
That's right.
It's a person. So we're especially predisposed to see that.
Seeing people in things is sort of, I mean, it's almost fun. It's not, there's nothing that I can see that's deleterious about that. But seeing patterns in things like a hot hand, for example, or just other kinds of patterns that don't really exist, those are more sort of insidiously problematic, right? Because we start to make conclusions that we shouldn't. How do we know when or is there a way to know when we are making some of those mistakes?
Well, arguably, that's what science is all about. We have these intuitions, we have this mental machinery that allows us to go through the world and we size it up. And again, we do a very good job of doing that. But, as anyone who's been alive for any length of time knows that we often make mistakes. And that's what got me into this field was it's so easy to make mistakes, to get things wrong, to size up people incorrectly, to, you know, uh, predict the future and be pretty confident about it, and the future turns out a different way. Um, so that science evolved. We
Yeah,
created all these techniques as a check on all of that. The commerce we do with the environment, we can misread it, and all of those principles that we know can be taught pretty well. And when you've learned how to think like a scientist, to recognize, some principles of probability and uncertainty, you, it's hard, but you see the world a little more clearly.
yeah. Something that I think is also helpful to think about is how we're so good at making stories to explain. Like so some of this, I feel like is you see a pattern, you want to make sense of things, and our brain is really good at making a story to convince us that we now understand it. And the split brain study that you describe in the book is just perfect
Yeah.
for that. I feel like. Can you describe that and maybe talk about it a bit?
Yeah, yeah. It's easier to describe that with a graphic of some kind. But here's the idea. Um, Well, let me describe a more recent study than that that's cut from the same cloth. Might be easier to describe without a graphic. That people are presented with guys are presented with two photos of women, and they're asked, which one do you find most attractive? And women are shown pictures of guys. It's all in a heterosexual context, and you indicate which of these two you find more attractive. And then the investigator will say, great, and show you sometimes the one that you picked and say, why did you find this person more attractive than the other? Sometimes with clever sleight of hand and the way they've set up the table with the photos, they show you the one you didn't pick and say, why did you pick this one? And amazingly, I forget what the percentage is, and it's not as high as in the study you described, but in a remarkable percentage of the cases, we just go right along and explain why we liked the one that we didn't pick better than the one that we did.
That's amazing.
We've
Yes.
got this explanatory machinery that's like a racehorse ready to go. And you ask me what caused this, and boom, there it is.
Right. We're so determined to make sense of the things around us and the things that we do ourselves
Yeah.
that we apply these narratives, right, as we're going through.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Very, very, very interesting example of that would be the Anton syndrome, where someone goes blind without realizing that they're blind, and then when they bump into furniture, initially they blame others for moving furniture
Yeah.
and not realizing that they're actually
Right.
creating all of this environment, not realizing they're blind. Kind of an extreme. Of that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's an opposite of that too, I think, where that you don't realize you can see. They think that they can't see.
Mm.
I forget the lesion. But they end up negotiating around chairs. Like they don't hit the obstacles.
Mhm.
And when they ask them how did you miss it, they make a story up for that too.
Mm.
Anyway,
Interesting.
Yeah. We definitely.
I should back up a little bit and point out that there have been 2 papers out about the hot hand that they don't contradict the reason we did our original research, which was we thought people exaggerated how streaky streak shooting really was, and that remains to be the case. But it does look, there are 2 different papers that show that there is a little bit of streakiness. One was a project done by a bunch of, not sure they were all from MIT, at least one of them were. They were students, and they got a hold of this data that are amazing. There are all these cameras in NBA arenas that take pictures of the floor several times a second. And it's just a massive amount of data, way more than we ever had. And when they look, they create this complicated equation to predict whether you're likely to make it or not. And one of the predictors is if you've made previous shots. But they have other things like how close is the defender? What position on the floor are you taking the shot? How far away from the basket is it? And they show there's a small amount of streakiness. You can index how much streakiness people expect, and it's vastly more than that. And that was the point of the research that we did. What we found was no evidence for it, which was convenient for us. It attracted a lot more attention than if we had said people exaggerate streakiness. But that paper, and then there's another paper saying that the way what we showed was there's no difference in your shooting percentage after you've made, let's say, 2 in a row or 3 in a row versus after having missed 2 in a row or 3 in a row. And the critique here is that's no difference is evidence of streak shooting, which seems mind-blowing in a way. But they do this statistical analysis to say that you would expect after several hits in a row, you would expect a lower percentage, or stated differently, more key to the hypothesis. After several misses in a row, you would expect more hits. Now, that can be mind-boggling. Wait a minute, the probability is, if there's no difference, that means there's no streak shooting. One way to think about it to make it intuitive, and we thought about this when we were doing our research, but we thought, well, with a long sequence, this won't make any difference at all. And this rival pair of economists said, no, it actually does matter substantially. And they have a paper showing there's evidence of some streak shooting. Anyway, the intuitive idea is when you're testing this hypothesis, you've got a streak of shots and you want to see if there's any streakiness. You're going to condition what's the probability that you make a shot after 3 consecutive hits. Well, you're conditioning it on 3 hits. So those hits, which have been part of the whole sequence that allows you to calculate what a player's shooting percentage is, they're used up. They can't go in the numerator anymore. And therefore, that overall shooting percentage has to go down.
So the expected value is different because of that.
Yeah. And that's what that paper
but still, the overall point is that we intuitively think that it's a much bigger effect than it actually turns out to be.
Yeah.
And interesting.
There was something interesting that Sanofi pointed out about something. Go ahead. Yeah.
I mean, specifically in terms of shooting basketballs, it's interesting that while reading your books, you bring up an expectation, right? So when teachers expect students to do well, they're told that those students will do well, they tend to do well. So one would think that if a basketball player is there, believes in the streak, is more likely to do well, and if the team believes that that player will do better, then they're more likely to do better. So that kind of leads us more to believe that there is some streakiness to it, at least from that perspective.
Right. There's like this counterbalance, this countervailing force.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, the idea of streak shooting is intuitive. The idea that there's no streak shooting is wildly counterintuitive, especially if you've played the game of basketball. You
Right.
just feel different after having made several shots in a row. And that then raises the question. We know that there are things like self-fulfilling prophecies and that success does breed success in some parts of the human experience and other parts not. And there needs to be a mechanism whereby the expectation, the feeling changes you and creates subsequent success. And there are probably a variety of places on the basketball court where that's true. If I succeed or my team succeeds, we're all going to be much more energetic players. And that can make us better for all of those things for which energy matters, rebounding, playing defense. So I'm absolutely convinced there's something like streakiness on defense.
Yeah.
You're getting killed. It's just, you sag a little bit and it's hard to be a good defender. But if you had some initial dominance of the player that you're playing against, it's just easier to stay energetic. Whether a ball goes through a hoop is a very nuanced kind of thing. Intensity may not be the big driver of that.
Yeah.
Another way of saying this is I've played basketball for many, many years, just recently stopped playing. And one of the reasons I love the sport, and I recognized I was going to have to retire at some point, so I picked up tennis in my 20s or something as a backup. And the sport seemed so different. And for a while, it made tennis hard for me because, when you're not doing well in basketball, adding motivation and intensity was a good thing. You're better if you get more intense. Become more intense as a tennis player. Ugh,
Right.
maybe for some people it works. For me, it did not. It just made me worse. And within the game of basketball, intensity is going to matter for rebounding, playing defense. And what you could say is a side lesson of the research on streak shooting is intensity may be good overall. It's not great for your shooting percentage.
Yeah.
It's not bad necessarily,
Right.
but
Does
it's
you
good.
don't find that flow state with the shots
Yeah.
per se, maybe. Yeah.
Yeah.
Friends, we hope you're finding value in the content. If you're enjoying what you're watching, please consider hitting the like button, help us with our YouTube algorithm. Consider subscribing to the channel and turn on the notification button to stay up to date with everything going on in the channel. If we could stay in the world of sports for a moment, there was I think it's the next chapter after that one in one of your books, that I just love this data point, which was that athletes sometimes want to stay away from the cover of Sports Illustrated. And,
Yeah.
and it's a great example of this regression to the mean.
Yeah.
Could you talk about that a little bit? I found I never heard of that, and it both rang true and also was surprising.
Yeah, one of the things, you talked about how can you avoid making mistakes and erroneous predictions is, to learn the scientific method. And one of the things that scientists have learned painstakingly, and it took a long time to learn it, is the regression effect and it's unbelievably broad when any two variables, doesn't matter what they are imperfectly correlated. Extreme scores on one of them is going to be associated with less extreme scores on the other. If you've done unbelievably well at whatever you do one night, you do it again the next night, you might do as well. That sometimes happens. You might do better. That sometimes happens. But on average, you're going to do worse. And that, it just shows up throughout nature. It's just a fact of uncertain events. So when are you going to be on the cover of Sports Illustrated? When your team is on a streak, when you've just won the championship, when great things have happened, boom, you get on the cover of Sports Illustrated. And some of those people, they're peaking and they're going to be greater still. Whenever Roger Federer was if he's ever, I assume he's been on the cover
Probably,
of
right.
Sports Illustrated, whenever he first got there for winning Wimbledon the first time, he's won it many times
Right.
since. That does happen. But on average, the people who get there, they obviously weren't hurt by chance. And during that performance, you resample, their ability shows itself, but chance also shows itself. Instead of giving a positive boost that led to the championship, next time maybe you get a negative tag and you're dragged down and don't win the championship. So on average, people who appear on the cover of Sports Illustrated are going to do less well, and athletes firmly believe this. I mentioned in the book this example of this amazing Olympic medalist, Shirley Babashoff, who had done very well in her career and got wind ahead of time. I think it was at Stanford. I think she was at Stanford. I'd be embarrassed if I got that wrong. She was in the pool and would refuse to get out of the pool because I'm not going to let those guys take my picture. I don't want to be on the cover of Sports Illustrated.
She ended up being on the cover, right? She changed her mind, or in any
The
event. I mean, can you imagine?
photographers were very persistent. Yeah.
Yeah, that's yes, that would be a shame to miss out, but it's a great example. And that plays out in so many different facets, right? It's such a good thing to be aware of. You were mentioning in the book about even like stocks, like a company has a banner year and people want to jump onto that. And I'm sure sometimes, like you said, it does lead to further success, but you'd be better off on the average, it sounds like, thinking, okay, if they had a great year, next year they're probably not going to have quite as good of a year.
Yeah. Yeah. No, and people, financial planners, personal financial advisors, if they're on their game, they will tell their clients, look, chasing after these actively managed funds, many of their clients will say, oh, this fund, it killed last year. We got to jump into that. And you'll say, well, actively managed funds, the fees that they charge are substantial. And so you're starting out, behind a few squares just by paying those fees. And however well they do one year, it's been shown time and time again that that's no predictor of how they're going to do the next year. So you're paying a lot for nothing, essentially.
Yeah.
That's why the advice is, index funds. Don't
I,
try to beat the market. That's kind of a fool's errand. Just if the
I,
stock market,
I
just
take
own companies, be a part owner of all these companies. Their job, and they're good at it, making money, and therefore you do pretty well just meeting the market average, you don't have to beat it and
I
trying to
take
beat it.
care of a few hedge fund managers, and a couple of them have started their own hedge funds. And I was talking to one of them, and he was talking about how it's nice to have the hedge fund and all that. And I said, do you think it's a good idea to invest with a hedge fund, like as an individual? Or he's, oh no, not necessarily. But they have great years for themselves, and it's it seems like paradoxically you might even look for a fund that didn't do well last year, with the idea that with a regression to the mean, they probably have, they might have a better chance of doing better, the following year.
Yeah. Yeah. There are some contrarian investors who subscribe to that idea.
Something that I thought was, there was a study that you talk about where if you want to get students to do better, or people to do better, right? I think the research basically says to reward rather than to punish.
Yeah.
But when you look at, when there was a study where you either praise students for being on time or you castigated them for being late, and then when you ask people to look at that data, they say, oh, it looks like if you punish them, then that's the better thing to do. Can you talk about that a little bit? Because I thought that was sort of counterintuitive and also right on the money.
Yeah, and it's another illustration of just the pervasiveness of the regression effect. You're going to see it everywhere. And unless you recognize it, you can conclude something about the world that is not true and is going to be counterproductive, that will mislead you. So when do you punish people? When they've done exceptionally badly. And so you fast forward to the next unit of time, on average, they're going to do better. And you're going to conclude, okay, what did I do? I left the person alone. They did badly. I criticized them. They did better. Oh, good for me. This is the strategy I should adopt. If a psychologist tells you, studies show that praising people for good performance works better than punishing them for bad performance, you're going to say, what do those psychologists know? Because my experience is the exact opposite. When people do extremely well, you fast forward to the next unit of time, on average, they're going to do worse. You would have praised them after doing extremely well, and your experience is that doesn't work. What are these psychologists saying? And so your experience teaches you, it punishes you for rewarding people, and it rewards you for punishing them. And therefore, you're going to do, it doesn't necessarily result in disaster. This is all probabilistic, but it's going to lead you to engage in behavior that is, at the very least, non-optimal.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it seems like this is something they should teach in more primary schools so that people can orient to the world a little more
Yeah.
thoughtfully.
Yeah. People have been saying that for a long time. We got to teach more critical thinking. We got to teach statistics earlier. And there has been a change. The people take statistics in high school now. Many students do, and that just was not an option when I was a
Me
student.
too. Yeah.
But I think we're going to see even more of that. I think we're on the cusp. A lot of people are talking about we got to change the math curriculum because we spend a semester in most programs teaching people trigonometry.
Yeah.
And, unless you're an engineer, do you really need to know that? And even if you're an engineer, all of those things, we have tools to construct
Mm.
those things. We don't really need those formulas in our heads. But we all encounter the regression effect in our daily lives all the time, and being able to recognize it. Yeah, we would be savvier consumers of our experience.
There was a really cool story that you had in the book. Also in Israel, they had a bunch of deaths, like a cluster of more deaths than usual in a place.
Yeah.
Do you want to tell that story real quick?
Yeah, people talk
Remember?
about this as like detecting order where there isn't any, and people in the medical profession have talked about, people will point out, oh, there's a big cancer cluster here. And sometimes there is something that's creating a cluster of cancers. And you've got to figure out if this is a real one and figure out what to do. But we're going to see those anyway, even if when things are randomly distributed, randomness isn't complete alternation. It's pretty clumpy. And so we're going to see just by chance lots of clumps, and therefore say, oh my God, look, I don't want to live there, when that's just the operation of chance. And in this case, it was a number of, it's, boy, I'm gonna,
I know it was a long time. That was
yes,
an older.
yeah,
There was a cluster of deaths, and these rabbis came to that area, and they said, "Well, we've recently let women come to the funerals, and so we need to stop that." So
yeah,
they stopped the women coming to the funerals, and then the deaths, the regression to the mean happened. The deaths came down, and and then you so nicely point out that, so what's the town going to conclude after that happens?
yeah.
Pretty clearly they're gonna draw some pretty interesting conclusions.
Yeah, and that goes back to the point you made earlier. Not only do we detect these patterns, but we're pretty skilled at coming up with explanations for them, even if
Right.
the explanations don't really hold water.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
and
If you gotta look at.
related to this pattern finding is another phenomenon, like a, a part of what's a set of things that we call the confirmation bias that everyone's familiar with, but it's really many things wrapped into one. Um, and that's the tendency to believe that things happen in threes.
Mhm.
And, confirmatory thinking is a big part of that, finding threes that really don't cohere. So you might remember, just as an illustration here, I think it was 2 years ago, maybe 3 years ago, the famous chef, TV personality, Anthony Bourdain, committed suicide, and roughly around the same time, this person who made all these designer purses, Kate Spade, committed suicide. And no other celebrity committed suicide during that time. And the mind doesn't say, didn't code those events as a failure of things happening in three. Like, oh, no. Uh, and yet, if there had been a third celebrity suicide,
You're right.
the mind would have seized on that. Everyone would have talked about it as an example of, see, things happen in threes.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. We definitely look for confirmatory and don't see the non-confirmatory.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, something I really wanted to ask about was the experiences. Can we pivot to that?
Yes. No.
All right. This is a bit of a pivot, but
Okay.
if you had $5,000, would you be better spending it on an amazing 1 week vacation where you have where you can spend money on amazing experiences, etc.? Would it be better to spend it on 2 weeks of a mediocre vacation where you get more rest maybe, but you don't go to the nice restaurant and do the nice activities? Or should you spend it on a really awesome painting that you always wanted for some I don't know how much paintings cost, but some nice object.
Yeah. Well, I'm afraid I can't comment on this because I'm professionally obligated to say that experiences provide more long-term enjoyment. But we're right in the middle. We've just decided to remodel our kitchen, so I feel too hypocritical to. But
But that's one of those gray areas, right? Because the kitchen is a continual experience in a
yeah,
sense.
um, yeah. But more seriously, we have shown, we've collected lots of data to show that in some ways, paradoxically, the enjoyment you get from these experiences lasts longer than the enjoyment you get from the thing that is still there. We adapt to the thing that's still there. The experience is gone, but we're changed in ways that are continually gratifying. And in study after study, we've been able to show, and other people have been able to replicate this, that people get more long-term enjoyment, satisfaction, think that their experiential purchases they've made are money better spent than their material goods. And the lesson here is not, don't remodel your kitchen, or you have to,
Stop the
don't,
kitchen.
you don't have to forswear all material purchases. Just shift a bit of your consumption more in the experiential end than the material end. Or another way of saying this, maybe this is the best way of saying it, is, we all have limited money, and sometimes we have this dilemma. Should I go to Machu Picchu or should I remodel the kitchen? And if you find yourself saying, well, if I did the experience, I'm sure it'll be good, but it'll come and go in a flash. So let me remodel the kitchen. You want to interrogate that
Yeah.
reasoning. It's not really true.
Have you been to Machu Picchu?
I have not. I usually mention in these examples places that I love and go, and I've said those places so many times that I feel compelled.
And if you're going to spend it on experiences, are you this was one that surprised me a little bit because it wasn't, the experiences, maybe I'd heard it before, but it kind of made sense to me. The idea of should you spend it on a week of an amazing vacation or that same money on 2 weeks or 3 weeks of less amazing?
Yeah. Yeah. This comes from the work by Danny Kahneman on what he calls the peak end rule. A lot of our enjoyment of stuff and the meaning that we attach to either stuff we acquire or experiences we have is recollection. You look back on that, have I lived a good life? Well, I've done this or I've owned this, etc. And what he shows in the looking back, how long an experience was just doesn't matter that much. While we're experiencing it, 2 weeks in Hawaii is better than 1 week. But when we're recalling it, the mind doesn't hold that duration. What you remember was what it was like at its best moment. If you saw a spectacular sunset on Honolulu Bay, that's the thing that sticks, whether you were there for 3 more days or 13 more days, it doesn't register. And what it was like at the very end matters. So again, we all have limited money. I can go to Hawaii for 2 weeks and live 2 miles from Honolulu, or I can stay right there in Honolulu Bay, but I can only afford to do so for 6 days. Oh, what should I do? We experience that as a dilemma, and psychology, the message of psychology often can be ambiguous. In this case, it's not ambiguous at all. There's a right answer to this, which is have the more intense, better vacation for a shorter period of time, and you won't regret it.
And it's a great takeaway point, so practical in that sense, but also the point that you make about the end of the vacation, and where you say don't spend it hastily packing and looking for gifts for someone, but make sure that you're prepared to make a nice, pleasant ending to the vacation.
Yeah, yeah. Do something really nice before you get on that plane.
Yeah.
It was so interesting. We're going to be talking with Jason Hansen, who's a CIA, former CIA person, and he talks about in his book that when you're trying to get information from someone, the people will remember the beginning of the conversation and the end of the conversation, but not so much the middle. So when you're getting information, you start off with pleasantries, and then you go into your question that you're really after, and then but before you end, you make sure that you finish with something more innocuous. It's just like that idea of that people remember the bookends, and it's the same thing with the vacation, right? You remember the ending in particular, but probably the beginning too. I would bet it's maybe it's similar where you at least have these high moments, and the rest kind of fades.
Yep.
I like what you said that our memories are more photographs than videos.
Yeah, well, I'm sure I said it, but especially right now with plagiarism being an important thing. I was not the first person to have said that. The great Czech novelist Milan Kundera.
You could be president of Harvard.
Yeah. Milan Kundera wrote it, and Danny Kahneman cites him for it, that memory doesn't make, I forget what he says, doesn't make films. It makes snapshots or,
something like that. Yeah.
And then studies also have confirmed those facts that where you look at somebody recalling, it kind of goes back to us making sense of those pictures that we see, because when different members of the family remember the same event, they may remember the highlights exactly the same way, but the intermediary events, how it led up, all of that ends up very, very different, because it seems that we do fill in and confabulate those parts once we remember the highlights and the.
I've noticed other people do that, but I don't do that.
Obviously not.
Yeah, no. Can we talk about gratitude?
Sure.
I know that's a big topic for you. Why is gratitude so important?
Bunch of answers to that. The way I like to summarize it is we people often use this phrase of, I try to always be my best self, and sometimes I fall short of, I wasn't my best self today. And there's a lot of research showing that whatever that best self is for you, you're better able to achieve it when you're grateful. And it's really hard for you to achieve it if you're the opposite of grateful. If you feel entitled, if you feel resentful, you're not your best self during those times. Now, why do I say this? A fair amount of it comes from research that David DeSteno at Northeastern has done, that, he creates these clever studies, kind of like the studies with clever manipulations that your dad did back in the heyday of dissonance theory, how to make people feel this psychological tension. In this case, he has people work on something for a really long time, and their computer on a computer, and the computer freezes up, and all the work seems like it's going to be for naught. But someone comes in, let me see if I can help you here, and restores. And so if you've got a grateful bone in your body, you're going to be really grateful to this person. And then you're given an opportunity to, in one of these economic games, you have to figure out how much money to keep for myself, how much to give away, either to that person, and not surprisingly, you're more generous to that person. But even if it's someone else, a third party, you're more generous to the world when this grateful thing had happened. Um, he also shows that people are more willing or better able to delay gratification. They will choose options that will allow them to get more later than less right now. The appeal of now is diminished. And so much of, you know, achieving, doing well in the world is delaying gratification, putting things off for bigger rewards in the future. And turns out you can do that more readily if you're full of gratitude. So, that's, I think, testament to how important it is. But then all these psychologists, I think they're all psychologists, maybe not, who've had people do things like keep gratitude diaries, and you look at their lives are better when they're in touch with gratitude. They sleep better, they visit the doctor less often, and their lives are better.
Is that the best way to foster gratitude, to keep a gratitude journal? Like how it seems like such an important, I mean, this podcast, we started it in large part to help people become the best versions of themselves, and gratitude seems like such a huge piece of that. How do you foster that?
The gratitude diary seems pretty tried and true. That is a very good one. I also think, and a number of people have talked about this, and now it's not many of them psychologists, but some of them economists, uh, pointing out you get people to appreciate the role of luck in life. And this is not to take away from, how hard people have worked, and they deserve credit for having worked hard and exercised great skill. But there are so many people out there with the same drive and the same skill who never got the chance or didn't get the little lucky break, and having an appreciation of that is really feeds the whole gratitude cycle.
You know, it's so interesting when you said that. It made me think of when we started medical school. There's a white coat ceremony where they give you your white coat, and then you start medical school. And we had this big ceremony, which I think every school has. And the dean said, "Look, this is the class is made up of all these people. There's quarterbacks and just different kinds of people." He said, "You guys weren't the best applicants to get in. You were just lucky. There was an equal number of people that we could have taken that were just as qualified, but we couldn't take all of them. So we
Uh-huh.
had to take just some. And you're here. So
Uh,
appreciate it." And that's, that's basically exactly
uh-huh.
right up that alley, right? That's
Yeah.
it's very clever.
Yeah, but that appreciation, we don't keep that appreciation after that lecture much.
Residency knocked that out of me.
Well, speaking of gratitude, there are some things that you've discussed as barriers of that. And one of the things that we ended up talking a lot about amongst ourselves is the headwinds and tailwinds idea. Could you speak to that?
Yeah, it's a metaphor, a physical metaphor that when you're out in the world and that you're facing a headwind, let's say you're running for exercise or cycling for exercise, you're aware of that headwind all the time. Or if you're a sailor, the headwinds, yeah, that's a problem you have to overcome, and you've got to do something to deal with it. It commands your attention. So we're always aware of the barriers we have to face. If you want to get forward, you better face them, pay attention to them, and overcome them. Um, and we can sometimes be aware of our tailwinds, but we don't really have to. They can just blow us forward. And sometimes we just coast on that and we aren't aware of them. So there's this big asymmetry. And I think it's kind of interesting that if you Googled right now headwinds, you would see photos of people, a guy with an umbrella, pointed in front of him and so on. You can capture what a headwind looks like, But if you type in tailwinds, you won't see a photograph. You'll see some kind of schematic depiction of wind at some stick figures back. And I think that's telling. What's true of the camera is true of our minds, that the again, that's the way life works. You have to pay attention to your barriers in order to overcome them. You don't have to pay attention to the things that are boosting you forward. Um, and it's just, I think it's so pervasive. An example I like to use, it illustrates this principle that, again, going back to Danny Kahneman has made, that a lot of the heuristics that he talks about are really um, the product of attribute substitution, that the world asks you a question, often a difficult question, and you don't really have an answer to it, but the mind comes up with the answer to a kind of related kind of question that just pops into your mind. And you substitute the answer to that question for the harder one without even noticing that you've made the substitution. So let me give you an example that illustrates this, that principle and how it applies to the headwind tailwind asymmetry. Um, there's a great hiking trail that runs from Yosemite Valley to the top of Mount Whitney in the Sierras in California, the John Muir Trail. And some people hike it from the south to the north, other people from Yosemite down to Whitney. And imagine the following thought experiment. You've hiked it, one of you has hiked it from north to south, the other from south to north. And I asked you, what percentage of the trail was uphill? That's a hard question. It's 211 miles. I wasn't keeping track of how much was uphill or downhill. So you've got to estimate you best you can. What's the mind going to grab onto? Well, how long was I walking uphill or downhill? It's harder hiking uphill than downhill, so it takes longer. So even though one way is more uphill than others, everyone who walks it, no matter what direction they're going, spent more time walking uphill and downhill. And to separate how long did I spend going uphill from what percentage of the trail was uphill, that's asking too much. That's just too hard. So we think, no, most of it was uphill. Uh, you've heard the phrase uphill both ways. Well,
Yes.
Yeah, and the barriers often last, right? Like the example of Scrabble, where you get, if you get
yeah,
good pieces and you play your good pieces, then they're just gone. You don't think about them again. But bad pieces, unless you take a turn to get rid of them, they're with you for several turns.
yeah, yeah. And you see that also, play out politically, that a political party solves a certain problem and they get credit for it for a very short period of time. And then it's gone. And the things they haven't done well
Right,
stick around.
right,
And that's why you maybe get more cycling between parties than you might otherwise expect, or you might even think is a good idea. So, it was Democrats largely who created Social Security, Franklin Roosevelt. Without Democrats in power and the large majority they had, they would never have had that. You don't get much credit as a Democratic politician for basically curing old age poverty in the way that the program has. And yet, in any kind of program, there's some problems, there are some abuses. You better believe they pay a price for the abuses when they're not getting credit for the benefit. Or same time, I think it was during the Roosevelt administration, and I think it was largely Democrats who were responsible for electrifying rural America. And the kind of poverty we had in rural America when there was no electricity was staggering. None of the you don't see Democratic
yeah,
politicians say,
right, right. I mean,
we're the ones who gave you electricity back then. But, the
yeah,
things that they didn't solve continue to hammer the party.
right. On the flip side, you have no, I guess after that, you have Ike putting in the roadways,
Uh-huh.
the whole interstate system. But I think like once you have something out there, whether it's Social Security or interstates, the other party latches onto it if it's popular. It's
Yeah.
like, well, we
Yeah.
like this too, you know.
Yeah. No, that's
But
right.
yeah, it's yeah, we tend to notice the failures more, right?
Yeah.
That's yeah.
Yeah. And the examples that I mentioned, I think they're, when we played with that a little bit, and the one that you mentioned, I think they're still true. But there's this interesting thing. I talked about Roosevelt creating Social Security or initiating it. And you talked about Eisenhower and the interstate system. It turns out we notice our headwinds more than our tailwinds almost, just so pervasively. But there are certain kinds of tailwinds that people do seem to acknowledge, and those are tailwinds produced by other people. People talk about, oh, I'm so great. If it wasn't for this person, this great teacher I had at that time, or had this advisor at Princeton who changed my life, blah, blah, blah. Academy Awards. People don't get up and talk, I came from a rich family and I had all these. They don't say that. They say, oh, well, acting coach. Um, and so there's a norm to pay attention to the tailwinds that have come from other people, to be grateful for that. There's less of a norm or less attentive so for the just broader non-personal
That's interesting.
tailwinds.
Why do you think that is?
I think it's related to the whole, one way of thinking about that is just to back up and say, oh, we said gratitude is a great thing. Why is it there? Well, all emotions are they're there to solve certain human problems. And this one, the emotion of gratitude, the reason it evolved is so that we could cooperate with each other. I do something for you,
Mm.
and I know that you're going to do something good for me, or you're going to feel terrible about it. And you'll do something good for someone else at some other time.
Binds
And
us.
every society has a norm of reciprocity, and you help fulfilling that norm if you have a strong sense of gratitude.
And that seems to be very pervasive. And we just spoke to Vernon Smith, who worked with Daniel Kahneman.
They share the Nobel Prize together.
Yeah, and he's a big fan of Adam Smith, and there's a lot of
Right.
a conversation about society and the fellow feeling that Adam Smith describes as an
Yeah.
empathy and how society works based on that. And a lot of the economic theories and experimental
Right.
theories were really proven because of that reciprocity and the idea that society really that gratitude really pays off
Yeah.
in the society. So in terms of gratitude, in terms of those tailwinds and asymmetry, just recognizing it allows you to be more grateful. Is that the idea?
That's the hope. We haven't been able to show that. We talk about that hope and draw upon the research on gratitude itself. Um, we have shown sort of the opposite of that. I talked about how gratitude makes it easier for you to be your best self. We've shown sort of the opposite, which is, when you're resentful, uh, it's harder for you to be your best self. And so we did a study in which we surveyed academic accountants. And academic accountants, like a lot of different fields, can be divided into experimental and non-experimental accounting. And then we asked them, you know, who has an easier or harder time getting their papers published, getting grants to do their research, getting tenure, etc. And both groups thought that the other group had it easier than they did. And our survey reminded them of that fact. And so right after that survey, we asked them about, what do you think about these different research practices? And some of them were ethically kind of dodgy, not egregious. Obviously, that's a terrible thing to do, but kind of borderline dodgy things. And the more you thought that the academic world was biased against your group,
Huh.
more you said, yeah, it's okay to put your name on a paper when you didn't do anything. And so people indulge bad things when they feel like the other people get bigger breaks than we did. And I had a former student just did a project with a bunch of students at Williams College that nicely illustrates how easy it is to think that other people have a break. He surveyed all the, or his students surveyed all of the intercollegiate. I think they were intercollegiate athletes, not club athletes. Maybe I'm wrong on that. There's like, I don't know, 19 different sports.
Right.
They were asked, okay, how much, how hard is it to play that sport and keep up with your academics? How physically demanding are the different, how demanding on your schedule is these different sports? On average, the participants in every sport said that their sport was more punishing than the other ones, either in terms of academics or just pure physical demands. And it makes sense from the headwind, tailwinds asymmetry. You have to face your burdens. You're very aware of them. Yeah, I know you have some burdens too, but that's an abstract thing.
So
Doesn't
we're
register.
all shooting for more gratitude than less resentment. Other than journaling, is there anything else you'd recommend for people who want to avoid resentment and lean into gratitude?
Um, going back to a subject that we touched on earlier, we found that people are more grateful for the things that they've been able to do than things that they've been able to have. You're more grateful for that. So, getting in touch with the great experiences you've had, it produces more gratitude than um, stuff that you've
Yeah.
accumulated. It's a great New Yorker cartoon from many years ago where guy's on his deathbed, apparently people are around the thing, and the caption is, "I should have bought more crap." And it's a cartoon. We all chuckle because we know no one would say that. That's not the stuff that you regret in your life. It's the experiences you didn't have. And then the flip side of that is the experience you did have just produces much more gratitude.
He obviously would have been saying, "I should have remodeled my kitchen better."
Yeah. Well, we suffered with that old kitchen for the later years. What were we thinking?
It's still so counterintuitive to me that in my gut, I feel like if I were able to keep in my head at the same time the idea of tailwinds and headwinds and the relative unfairness of life, as in drawing more tiles in Scrabble, at the same time with regression of the mean to the mean, then I'd be able to be more grateful and not be so down when I do get those tiles. But that doesn't seem to play out when you run experiments. Is that the idea? That it doesn't pan out just because we're aware of the regression as well as all of those perceptions, that we'd be more grateful?
I don't know. I mean, the work on I'm just going to have to be agnostic on that. The work on gratitude shows there's a fair amount of gratitude out there. It can, there can be more, and things like writing gratitude diaries help. But I don't want to undersell. Without a diary, people are, ingrates. I don't want to say that. There are challenges. There are things that can make you not appreciate stuff that you really should be appreciating. And, some of that is just about inattentiveness, stuff that's not as available, like your tailwinds, and adaptation. We get used to stuff and we forget about it. So if we have some kind of, I've had this structural advantage in my life that I got to college with no debts. And, occasionally I'll hear about, students today who have crushing debts, and that will remind me and I'll appreciate it. But absent that, it's so easy to go through life not aware of, hey, that was you came around at just the right time where you could go to a very good college for something close to free.
Oh, it sounds like there's some work for some grad students out there to be thinking of how to foster it more and more.
Yep.
There's a quote in your book. Well, it's a joke sort of from George Carlin, that everyone driving slower than me is an idiot. Everyone driving faster is a maniac. And we do things like it's in your book too. If you're eating food and you find it too spicy, then it's too you think that you're actually saying something about the food rather than your taste. And there's this tendency for us to think that our experience in the world is sort of a one-to-one relationship. If I don't like how that Zanovi made the room colder, it's because he doesn't realize that the room was the right temperature.
Yeah.
Why do we have these ingrained biases that what we see in the world is the world?
I think in that case, it's that, a whole bunch of uh, the processes that allow us to perceive the world just go on unconsciously. We're unaware of them. What we see is the product. That this is what the world looks like to us. We've filtered it, we've construed it, we've constructed it partly. And what we see is the construction. We don't see all the things that constructed it. And therefore, that's a ineluctable product of our experience. That's the way that it is. And the Carlin quote, it's just brilliant. And it's even more brilliant than it seems. Even the idea of slow and fast, you see this politically that, a lot of people will think um, that their political views are the right ones, because if they were wrong, if they recognized they were wrong in any way, they'd move to what was more right. And therefore, people on the left are too far on the left, people on the right are too far on the right. And you often will feel as, oh, I'm this moderate, the sensible moderate. And these people are pressuring me to, I think we should change in this way. And I get it, and I want to change too. But if we go too fast, we're going to get resistance. And I think we're going the right speed. No, no, no. Try to speed this up, we're going to be terrible. And then other people are saying you're going way too slow, and you say, well, you get the idea.
Yeah,
Either way, it doesn't seem right. So the Carlin quote, it's not just about traffic.
right.
It applies to political life too.
And the wisdom, because again, along the lines of making ourselves a better version of ourselves, and your book is called the wisest in the room, or the wisest one in the room, is to just be aware of this dynamic, right? Because if that you realize that everyone else in the room is thinking that what they're seeing,
Yeah.
that they have the politics just right, that they have the temperature right, and that we're all coming at it a little bit differently.
Yeah, I think, recognizing, taking to heart what Carlin had to say, is, if you think about it, it makes you a more compassionate person. Because if you haven't taken to heart, you don't appreciate the wisdom of that quote. When someone espouses a position that's very different than yours, that seems completely wrong, you can easily think, they're only claiming that, or they don't really believe it, or the reason they believe it is for some self-interested reason. They're pushing some kind of personal agenda that's going to benefit them. Sometimes that's true, but if you recognize, no, that's the way the world looks to them, and it really feels right, you've got a different situation with respect to that person, and it makes you okay. They aren't picking a fight here.
Right.
That's the way they see it. We differ. Okay. How can we see it the same? You start the discussion very differently.
And on top of that, it seems like it's like an onion in a sense, but where there are different levels. Like you have a different orientation to things, and then that makes you perceive things differently. And where I'm going with that is the study that you talk about in the book about people that were either anti-Israel or pro-Israel, pro-Palestinian or pro-Israel, and they watch the exact same news coverage over. This is a study back in the 80s, or
Yep.
at least they were looking at data from the 80s.
Yep.
They're watching the same news coverage, and they come away with diametrically opposed. Like the people that were pro-Israel see the news coverage as biased towards pro-Palestinian, and vice versa. And both of them think that an independent observer will see it the exact same way that they see it. And I mean, it was just, to me, it was striking that people watching the exact same event can literally come away with completely different impressions of it.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. And you see it with, anyone who's trying to find the right middle ground. People think the refs are biased against their side, or a
Well, they are
mediator
biased.
to a
Well, but
mediator to a dispute. Wait a minute. Why are you siding with them? Or someone trying to a couples therapist can be thought of as being biased by both sides, biased in favor of the other. Because if you're seeing the world the way that it is, anyone who sees it halfway between you and the other person's version, they're biased too, just not as much as the other person.
Well, and when we are looking at someone else and we see them as biased, we are obviously looking through our own bias. And I guess a silly question is it possible not to have a bias? Is it possible to see the world without a bias?
Um, Boy, that's sad. That's so broad.
that's a what is truth.
I'm trying
Well,
to spin
it
my
is.
wheels here, figure out.
It is because that seems to be kind of, if talking philosophy, it seems to be that's what kind of spins someone like Descartes into the rabbit hole where he goes into and starts questioning reality. And and his explanation of biases is a demon, because
Yeah.
that's the language he was using at the time. Um, but that's essentially, if we recognize the fact that we don't see the world without a bias and someone else doesn't, then it should make it easier for us to have that conversation. And I think that's kind of the bottom line. The takeaway, at least
Right.
for us, that it was, is that when we call somebody else biased, it should be an immediate trigger to say, okay, well, yes, and so are we.
Yeah.
And then we can disarm that and back away and
Yeah.
start.
And we were talking about this before because I was saying, but there are some times when you're not biased and the other person is biased. But I mean, there are times when I think, and maybe it's if you're not as involved in a situation, if there's a conflict in a different part of the world that I don't have a horse in the race, maybe I can see it a little less. Maybe that's but certainly you bring your own biases still into it. But I would imagine that if you're not emotionally charged with something, it allows you a certain amount of perspective that you might not have if you're inside of it. And that's okay to recognize too.
Sure.
I would think.
A better perspective, but not a bias-free perspective.
Sure. Yes. I can meet you halfway
Yeah.
there. But I guess that is the takeaway, right? It's just to recognize that that we're all coming at things with our own intrinsic biases. And so even when we watch the news together, we're seeing maybe a slightly different reality unfold because of our perspectives.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. Recognize, another way of thinking about this is, what are some just the most general principles of psychology that aren't talked about as much as maybe they should? And if you had those in your head, you would have an edge in the world. You'd see things more
Yeah.
clearly. You may not get into as many conflicts. One of them is recognizing that what we think of as the world out there is our interpretation of the world out there. The world, we use the example of color. It looks to us like the world is colored this way, that inheres in the object, but it's really about the light reflecting off of it and how our systems register that. And we're kind of critical of organisms that don't see what we say. We talk about dogs being colorblind, like they're not seeing it the way that it is. We don't smell it the way that it is. They can smell differently. We don't think that we're odor blind. So I think that idea, this naive realism idea that, you can't touch the world, perceive the world directly. It's largely filtered, importantly filtered, is one thing. Another one is, and kind of related in a way, is recognizing that people don't respond to the stimuli in the world that they encounter. They respond to the meaning that they assign to that stimuli. And if we have that in our heads, it leads us to think, all right, this seems stupid to me what this person's arguing. What does it mean to them? Why do they have it? Again, it's a slightly more, doesn't mean you have to agree, you're going to agree with them or you should agree with them, but at least you understand where,
Right. That's a great segue into framing, right? Because that goes into frame,
yeah,
you talk about that with the organ donations, right? And when organ donations are made as a default, people perceive it in one way, and when organ donations are made as something you have to opt into, I forget the countries. I think Sweden, you opt out, and I forget exactly, but in any event, like there's, if you have to opt in or opt out, you assign a different meaning to what you're doing
yeah,
based
yeah,
on those things,
yep,
and you act very differently as a result.
yep, absolutely. And, uh, one of, I think, a lot of people think of psychology as squishy, or it's impossible. I don't want to be a psychologist because it's just too hard to really get the truth. And well, let's break that down. What do you really mean by that? Yes, it is hard because people are reacting to the meaning they assign to stimuli rather than the stimuli themselves. Studying the stimuli themselves is an easier, not that it's easy, but it's an easier job than trying to understand how you're going to assign meaning to it. That's just slipperier. And one of the reasons I personally sort of felt okay about going down this path of being an academic psychologist was, you know, in the cognitive revolution and in Kahneman and Tversky in particular, riding that cognitive revolution wave, the early part of it, um, it seemed like, hey, we can figure out some of the big cuts, the big principles that determine the meaning of things. How you frame it matters. What's most cognitively available influences the meaning that you interpret. Did you encounter what you encountered just before and anchored on influences the meaning that you assign to it? Does it tell a coherent story? Representativeness powerfully influences the meaning you assign to it. So it seemed like, yeah, meaning's always going to be slippery, and therefore people are always going to be a little unpredictable, but we can figure out a lot.
Yeah, that's a really, you can have the right, because you can have the same thing happening, but depending on how you're perceiving the meaning of it, you'll actually act in a very different way. So first you have to establish what is the meaning.
Yeah, yeah. There's this great study that Uri Ganizi was one of the authors. I'm forgetting the others. I feel bad about that. They did this study. I don't know what motivated this study. It was a study of a child care center, a set of child care centers. I hope I'm getting that right. In Israel, where they had a problem with parents just arriving too late. And so they did a very sensible sounding, seeming thing. Let's make the parents who show up late, let's make them pay a fee. And then more people showed up late, not fewer. Wait a minute, we're doing just what the economists say. Make it more costly, you'll get less of the behavior. You made it more costly, you got more of the behavior. Well, why is that? When there wasn't this fee, the parents who arrived late probably felt a little guilty. Oh, I'll do better next time. But once you impose this fee, they
Yeah.
thought of it, that's the
Yes.
word I'm using, as a fee. Okay,
I,
great, a transaction. You stay late, I give you this. I don't feel bad. Good.
yes, I've thought of that study with our kids when the schools, either impose a fee or they just ask you to come, and I wondered if I thought they should read that study.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
and similarly, there was a school that you mentioned in the book that they raised their tuition
Right.
very high, and that
Yeah,
encouraged there's a psychologist who did a similar thing. I forget who it was, but they realized that they were that by charging too little, they were letting people think that they had less value, and so
yep,
they raised their rates, and in this case, the college raised their tuition rates, and then people perceive more value in it, and so they run to it.
yeah, yeah. No, that was really quite striking.
Yeah, it's interesting to Yeah, to think about that. And how you present yourself also. Where should we go next? There's maybe I could ask, we've mentioned Kahneman and Tversky a few times,
Yeah.
and they have a really interesting study that dovetails nicely with a bunch of things that you talk about in the book, including this study, which is that if you have the choice of saving 200 people for sure, or a 1/3 chance of saving 600 people, people choose to save the 200 because it's sort of in the bag. They know they're going to save them. But if you say to them, well, would you like to doom 400 people to death, or you have a 1/3 chance of saving 600, then when you frame it that way, they save they take the chance of saving the 600. And basically, depending on how you frame that, and depending on whether or not people are thinking of the potential upside or downside, people seem to be markedly averse to a downside. Um, and you see that in a bunch of different arenas. Could you
Yeah,
speak to that?
absolutely. And there's, a couple things at play there. Uh, two very powerful parts of human psychology. One is, as they put it, losses loom larger than gains. Losing something, these number of people die, is more powerful than positive things are. This number of people are saved. Or, if you found out that your bank account for, some error in your tax return, you just lost $30,000. That hurts a lot more than, oh, we made an error in your return. Here's $30,000. You feel great. Oh, wow, 30,000 extra dollars. Don't want to underestimate how great that would be, but it wouldn't be as influential. It wouldn't pack the same punch positively as that negative punch would be. So that's one principle at play there. And the other one is what's called the Weber-Fechner principle, that, there's diminishing marginal utility, that saving 600 people would be great. But every additional life past that 200 matters less and less. Wow, I can save 200 people. I better do that. Chasing, I mean, there could be zero. I could take a chance and save zero. What about that 200 people I could have saved? All the additional 400 lives, each one of them matters less and less. Flip that to the negative. Now we're talking about the more costly deaths. Oh man, you've killed 400 people? I can't accept that. That's no way I can do that. And so I'll take a chance. Maybe 600 will die, but there's only a chance of that. So you take the gamble there. It's just a striking example of the combination of those two principles and how framing matters. It's the same thing. Saving 200 is losing
Right.
400 of them, but you just describe it in different ways. And they have parallel studies of how physicians will think about operations, different treatment options,
Yeah.
whether they're described in terms of longevity or the number of people who survive a certain period versus the number who die in that period.
Yeah, that was particularly depressing as a doctor to see that doctors are making the same statistical errors. It was hypothetical treatments for lung cancer,
Yeah.
and they did this exact same replication of it. Yeah, that
But
was,
one of the lessons of that, I like that you said that, it's really particularly depressing as a doctor,
yes,
yourself. Um, but one of the messages of the Kahneman-Tversky research that, has made them so justly famous is the errors that they talk about aren't the errors of uneducated people. You can educate your way out of it, but you can be very educated and still make these errors. They aren't the errors of uneducated people. They aren't the errors of cognitively challenged people.
right.
These are the errors of people.
Yeah.
They apply to all of us unless we're very careful.
There's something in the book where I said it to everyone in my family and everyone laughed because it was so true, which is, would you like to have 80% lean beef tonight? Yeah, great. Okay. Would you like to have 20% fat beef tonight? No, 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 no. I don't want that. That sounds
Right.
terrible.
Yeah. 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 The language we use.
Yeah.
matters.
And it does kind of harken back to what Vernon Smith was saying about with Adam Smith, that there are these universal truths that run through hundreds of years of, it doesn't matter when, where, culture. There are some things that are just wired into, it seems, the human existence.
Yeah.
So it's good to be aware of them. Speaking of that, um, the foot in the door phenomenon was
Uh-huh.
striking. Can you talk a little bit about that and the study that came to mind first was the stickers in the window,
Yeah.
to have people drive safe, but you could take it any which way.
Yeah, this was a study, one of the classics in social psychology. It would be good to see more replications of this because this was back in the day with small samples, etc. Um, but what happened is homeowners, boy, this is really an old-fashioned study. You could never do this study now the way they did it. You can do a parallel kind of study, but people, knocked on doors. Now no one knocks on anyone's door unless they know the people.
Be
Uh,
dangerous.
yeah, yeah. Knocked on doors and said, we're with, and they mentioned some pro-social activity, organization. Would you be willing to put a small sign saying, keep California beautiful, or I'm a safe driver? Didn't matter which it was. They're going to influence the dependent variable, the thing we care about equally. Um, you put that in your window, and most people will say yes to that tiny thing. Well, all right, I'll do that. And then 2 weeks later, someone else shows up and says, would you be willing to put this yard sign, a bigger yard sign in your house saying, drive carefully, some such message like that? Now you're asking something much bigger. And some people are asked that out of the blue. They didn't have to put this sticker in their window ahead of time. And some people, it's a second request, again, by an unrelated person. And it's a big, ugly sign. So most of those people approached out of the blue say, nah, I believe in the cause, but nah, I don't want to do that. But if you've put this little sign in front of your window, you're different. That little act makes you a little different. I support causes like this. So now when they ask the bigger one, sure, I'll do
Yeah.
that. And they got a much higher percentage. And this ties into some ways go in a certain conceptual leap relates back to where we started about momentum. That behavioral is prone to momentum, and the most famous psychology experiment ever conducted, Stanley Milgram's studies of obedience to authority, where everyone goes, oh my God, that's unbelievable that people were willing, thankfully it didn't actually happen, but people were willing to administer 450 volts of electricity to another person. That seems unfathomable, and it is unfathomable. In fact, no one would do that. If you ask someone, hey, flip this switch and deliver 450 volts of electricity, no one would do it. But that's not the situation. They were first asked, can you deliver 15 volts? Okay, as part of a learning study. Now, how about 30? Okay. And you get on this slip. That's why we have this term, beware of slippery slopes, because they are slippery. You get some momentum going, and it's hard to get off that slippery slope. Uh,
It would have been neat if he had compared it with another Milgram study where he just starts at a higher level, just to show. I mean, I would imagine, I would hope and think that they would not do it like he said.
Yes. Yeah.
But
Yep.
that would have been an interesting comparison, I think.
Yeah.
You know,
No, and the lessons are broad there, with democracies that lost democracy. It wasn't
Mm,
usually in a dramatic overthrow. It was, okay, this is different. We've
right.
we've we've changed the law. I can live with that. Now we've changed this one, and suddenly, you're the frog in the boiling water, the gradually boiling water, where, wait a minute,
Right,
we
right.
don't have our freedoms anymore.
And then there's the positive reciprocal aspect of it, which was I found striking. You talk about um, Stein writing a book about World War II and about the heroes in I think it was in Germany, but under Nazi occupation, who went, who risked their lives to save Jewish people by hiding them. And he went back to look at it, and he was looking for any kind of reason that they did that, and there wasn't any ideological, religious, anything that kind of ran through, and it seemed like it was more that foot in the door of, yeah, okay, I'll hide you for a night, and then slowly they did more and more heroic actions.
Yep. Yeah, you see it both ways. I mean, it's a general principle of behavior. We can, baby steps. There was this comedy from the 80s, What About Bob, where the annoying client and the therapist, his big breakthrough, I think he has a book out that's making him a celebrity, and Bill Murray is interfering with that. The big insight was baby steps. Man, there's a lot of wisdom to that.
Yeah. But Bob took over the show there.
Yeah, he did. Yes.
That was great.
Spotlight.
Oh, spotlights. Yes. I asked my dad what would be a good question for you. And he told me that I should make sure to ask you about the spotlight effect, that you were instrumental in that. Could you talk about the spotlight effect?
Yeah. We're, as people say, social psychologists especially say that, we're social creatures, and we need to fit in with other people. When we're isolated, we don't do well. So the regard of other people is tremendously important to us, and that can make it seem to us the importance we attach to what are other people thinking about us can make us think that they are thinking about us much more than they really are, that they're paying attention, and that there's a kind of a social spotlight on us. There's actually, getting back to comedies from the 80s, I think this was from the 80s, there's a Steve Martin comedy called The Lonely Guy, where he walks into a restaurant to dine alone. And incidentally, a lot of people will say, I'll never do that. If I'm traveling by myself, I'll never go to a restaurant. I'll go to a grocery store and have a package of cheese for my dinner rather than that, or I'll eat in my room. And this movie really reinforces that. Mater D comes up to Steve Martin and says, "How many in your party, sir?" And he says, "I'm dining alone." Alone. And the whole room stops. No one utters the sound. A spotlight comes down, and he's escorted to his seat, and everyone's staring at him. And our studies were, essentially experimental versions of that, where you have people engage in activities, maybe embarrassing, maybe things that would seem triumphant. And either way, whether it's negative or positive, people think that more people than actually do are paying attention to them and judging them harshly if it's negative, or being impressed with them when it's positive.
Are there, if you're aware of the spotlight effect, does that mitigate it? Like, if you know that if you go into the restaurant and sit by yourself, nobody cares. Like, no one's looking at you, no one cares. Does knowing that allow you to enjoy your meal and just go in and do it, or no?
I don't know if you could ever get rid of it, but I know examples of this. I have a close friend, a well-known economist, Bob Frank, who spent a year in Paris on a sabbatical, and he went to some, what would you call it, a gym, an exercise facility, and he was going to go swimming there, and he didn't have swim trunks, and they, and the only thing they could offer him was a Speedo, and he's thinking, he would never be caught dead in a Speedo in the United States. He's going like, it's either this or no swimming. And he told me that, well, I thought of your spotlight study, and it gave me just enough courage to actually do it. It didn't eliminate the self-consciousness, but it diminished it enough that he actually went swimming and was glad that he did.
Well, that's good. I'm glad he did.
Some people advise to make these little experiments for yourself, to do something that's just a little bit outside of your comfort zone, to really experience the spotlight effect and the fact that, oh, nothing terrible is going to happen. People are actually not paying as much attention to you as you think, and maybe diminish some of that anxiety associated with it.
Sort of use it like a muscle.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah,
you're like you're
exercise.
building a
Yeah.
muscle.
Yeah.
Have
Yeah.
people looked at that? Is that a field of study that that people have looked
Um,
at?
Clinicians have done a sort of simulated version of that. Maybe they've done what you've described exactly. I'm not aware of it, but they do a version like, okay, you're worried about what other people are going to think. Who are these people? Or here, or you can even draw it out graphically. Here are all the people that would be exposed to it. What percentage of them do you think are going to notice? And no one does everyone. They draw a little
Right.
circle. Okay. Now we're down to 60 people. Of those 60, how many of their opinions do you care about? Zip, you got to draw a smaller circle. And then at the end, you end up with a circle that seems manageable. And people go out and do those kinds of things.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, it's a bit of like exposure therapy mixed with sort of
Desensitization.
yeah.
Yeah.
I like it. Oh, there's one more that I feel like we need to get to, or we'd not be doing our job. The hedonic elevator, I thought was a really, I had actually never heard that term. I think you had. Could you describe the hedonic elevator and why it's so important to be aware of it? Because it seems like such an important phenomenon to me.
No, I'm not familiar with. So what the hedonic, you mean the hedonic treadmill? Is that what you're talking about?
Did I say elevator?
Correct.
Yeah, you did.
Well, we'll edit that out.
Yeah,
Sorry.
yeah, that gets back to the idea of adaptation that we talked about, that we just, it's a huge principle of how the mind works. We just adapt to things. The mind is evolved to respond to how things are changing, not the things that are stable. You just tune them out. And that is a great thing when it comes to bad things in life. And, there are these famous studies of people who've experienced spinal cord injuries, and in the immediate aftermath, it's just horrible. They're miserable. And a lot of them say, I don't want to go on anymore. But they adapt to it. They're taught how to handle it to some degree. So it's a triumph of the medical profession. But above and beyond that, they get used to it. And if you survey, as some people have done, spinal cord injury victims a couple years down the road, their well-being reports, how happy they are, look a lot like ours. The percentage of them who say that, my life is close to my ideal is like the population as a whole. So the fact that we adapt to stuff is great when, I'm now an old person. If you had just, getting back to small baby steps, if you became an old person overnight, it would be like, oh shit, this is terrible. But, you get a little
Why do I
more
feel all my
diminished
joints?
every day, and you get used to it, so it becomes much more manageable. So for bad things, adaptation is great. But for good things, of course, it's bad. We say, let's say a kid of yours, there's reason to believe your kid's has some condition that's really terrible, and there's gonna be a test done. And you're waiting to hear the test, it's like, oh, please have it come out to be positive. I swear, if it's positive, I'll never care about these insignificant things again. And then there is this, comes out, nope, false alarm, nothing. You're as happy as you could possibly be, and you're grateful, and you're not sweating the small stuff. You know what's important in life for a little while, and then you're back to the same thing of getting mad at the person in the office next door for some trivial thing, or getting mad at the people on the road are either morons or maniacs, So it can be a problem. And the way that Phil Brickman talked about it, this is, in order to be happy, you're like the rat in a treadmill. You have to run faster and faster to get ahead. You have to accumulate more. People in a career will often say, oh, if I just accomplish this, I'll be happy forever. You accomplish it, you're as happy as you thought you'd be, but the forever part, that's elusive. and then now you need more. So we're on this hedonic treadmill.
Right. And there's a positive part of that, I'm sure too, which is you always, it keeps you wanting to look for the next challenge.
Yeah.
But the negative part to your psyche is, I guess that's where journaling, like for gratitude,
Yeah.
might come in, I suppose, because it constantly reminds you.
Yeah. Yeah, we talked about the positive part of gratitude, and maybe it's all positive. I'm a gratitude fan, but some people have argued that, look, if you're so grateful, oh, this turned out so well, the kind of, speaking to what you're saying, the kind of fire in the belly you need to say, wait a minute, yeah, I am grateful for this, that, and the other thing, but society's got some real problems, and we've got to work on that,
Yeah.
and that's an open question that makes a
Oh,
lot of sense, that you might be less willing to man the barricade, so to speak, if you're grateful.
I
But
mean,
we don't know the answer to that. And I'd like someone to, you could imagine either way that, no, life's not so bad. We're good. Let's enjoy this. Or you could imagine, as David DeSteno has shown, it's easier to be the best version of yourself when you're grateful. And if that best version of yourself is someone who sees injustice and wants to rectify it, maybe you're more likely to do it. And I'd love to see a study like that.
yeah. The advice that I tell my kids anyway is you need to be grateful, for all of these amazing opportunities you have, but you also need to respect them and honor that with your hard work, right?
Uh-huh.
Like it's great to be grateful. You need to be grateful. You need to show your gratitude by not disrespecting your opportunities. It seems like to me that's where the
Yeah,
balance might lie.
yeah, yeah. So I think there's a study lurking there.
All right, grad students, you heard it here. You heard it
Yeah.
here first. So, there's a Cornell lab waiting for you.
Okay.
We've taken up so
Yeah.
much of Tom's time.
Yeah. We should wrap it up.
We should wrap it. Tom, thank you so much. You've been wonderful. I have about 64 more pages of questions, but maybe we can have you back sometime.
Another time, sure. No,
Yeah.
this has been fun. It's been great talking to you guys.
Friends, thank you for your attention. We hope you've enjoyed the conversation. If you find value, please remember to hit the like button, help us with our YouTube algorithm. Consider subscribing to the channel and turn on the notifications so you can stay up to date with everything going on with the channel. And please leave us a comment, let us know what you thought about the show and also what you'd like to hear about in the future.